Welcome everyone to Analyzing Trends. I'm Simon, and today we're cutting straight into what's shifting as we move toward 2035. For decades, people built whole conferences on the East versus West divide. Western individualism on one side, Eastern collectivism on the other. But here in 2025, that framework doesn't just wobble, it collapses. The categories don't map onto reality anymore. America, once the archetype of open, immigrant-driven identity, is narrowing its circle of belonging. Meanwhile, in China, a culture long organized around duty and collective sacrifice, you see young people celebrating autonomy through memes like tangping and even hosting resignation parties with cakes iced, "I quit." Japan and South Korea, countries once protective of homogeneity, are opening their doors out of demographic necessity. And Latin America is exporting hybridity through music and digital culture, even as its politics swing between inclusion and control. The point is simple. Those familiar binaries, individualist versus collectivist, open versus closed, no longer help us see clearly. They dissolve the moment you look closely, and what emerges is a far more complicated, far more interesting cultural story.
Absolutely, Simon. And I think what's striking right now, especially when you study generational shifts, is how quickly those East-West categories fall apart. Younger people in the US are not lining up behind a single idea of belonging. Some are doubling down on purity tests about who counts, while others are pushing for fluid, hybrid identities. And in China, you see the opposite playbook, young people stepping out all together. The tangping movement, the rat people, even those viral resignation parties, they're not just jokes. They're ways of saying self-care is resistance. And what's fascinating is how that logic mirrors the US, just inverted. Both sides are wrestling with burnout, belonging, and autonomy, but through entirely different cultural languages.
Exactly. What's remarkable is how identity and openness feel unpredictable now, slippery categories rather than fixed traits. The US, a nation long defined by immigration, is drawing inward. China, once anchored in collective duty, now shows this undercurrent of autonomy, especially among its youth. These aren't marginal exceptions, they're structural shifts, and together they push us past the old maps. That's why 2025 doesn't read like just another chapter. It reads like a hinge point, a threshold where the contradictions themselves generate new possibilities.
Yeah, and that's the thing, even the old shorthand, West as individualist and East as collectivist, has flipped on itself. What we're really seeing isn't opposition, it's reversal and remix. Cities across both so-called East and West are inventing their own logics, grounded in local pressures but connected through global flows. They don't fit the binary at all, which is exactly why we need new methods, ways of reading culture that catch those shifts instead of forcing them back into outdated boxes. So, Simon, this is where my academic side has to wave a flag. Culture isn't a checklist of fixed traits. It's better understood as a living story system. Think of it as a flow of narratives, symbols, memes, even everyday rituals, constantly mutating. Within that flow, you see residual threads that linger from the past, dominant codes that set the tone in the present, and then those emergent signals and sometimes outright disruptions that hint at what's coming next.
That's exactly right. I keep going back to the Cold War because it shows how dominant narrative binaries used to be. For half a century, that East-West divide was almost impossible to unsee, but now it's a ghost. Those frames have lost their grip. What we have instead are new story moves. Look at Japan experimenting with immigration out of demographic necessity, or Brazil redesigning financial infrastructure through the PIC system, policies that rewrite daily life in ways no binary can capture. Or consider South Korea's workation visa, lifestyle and labor blurred into one. These aren't fixed traits, they're cultural chess moves, narratives in motion, shifting the board right under our feet.
What I find fascinating is that this is where semiotics really does the heavy lifting. Memes, small gestures, even everyday rituals, they often reveal more than any survey about cultural dimensions. They're signals of deeper currents in motion. When people turn quitting a toxic job into a kind of rite of passage, or when a marginalized genre like reggaeton gets remixed into global pop, they're not just following trends, they're rewriting meaning as they go.
And what's striking is how those meanings don't sit still, they travel, they mutate. The method, if we can call it that, is really about tracing the archetypes and stories as they change roles. What lingers as residual, what sets the tone as dominant, what starts to break through as emergent, and what pushes the edges as disruptive. That movement tells us far more about the futures taking shape than any static cultural map ever could. Let's shift into the first future scenario, cosmopolitan laboratories. This one's close to my heart. You see it most vividly in places like Seoul, Singapore, and Mexico City. They're not just melting pots, they're ongoing remix studios. Walk into a co-working hub in Mexico City and you'll hear half a dozen languages, people juggling hybrid gigs, trading ideas over tacos, collaborating across continents. That's lived hybridity, not theory. And policy is reinforcing it. Brazil's PIX payment system lowers friction for cross-border collaboration, while Korea's digital nomad visa, utopian as it sounds, signals a real embrace of mobile talent.
What's striking to me is how these experiments show up simultaneously in policy and everyday life. Mexico City's residency pathways for remote workers, Singapore's points system for employment passes. These are design choices that open channels for new flows of people and ideas. And then you've got reggaeton, which to me isn't just music. It's a living text of hybrid belonging. The bilingual code switching, the platform-native production, the constant remix across borders, all of it shows that the real cultural energy is in hybridity, not purity.
Spot on. And what really animates this are the emergent archetypes. You see the explorer, the creator, the jester, bringing in that sense of play and experimentation. At the same time, the rebel and the sage are pressing on the system, testing its limits, making sure it doesn't settle too quickly. Put those energies together and the laboratory isn't just a metaphor, it's cities themselves running live experiments in how culture gets remixed and redefined.
That's why I'd argue a single walk down a Mexico City block tells you more about the future than a dozen white papers. These laboratories aren't just about technology. They're about how culture itself gets prototyped in public, in the noise and rhythm of everyday life. So let's turn to a much darker scenario, fortress individualism. Here you get the paradox, endless rhetoric about freedom paired with ever narrower boundaries. Difference is treated as risk instead of resource, and the story of protecting us pushes institutions to test loyalty, exclude outsiders, and enforce purity codes.
And I have to say, this pattern isn't new. It's one of those cultural reflexes that keeps resurfacing. Look at the US today. Massive immigration raids at industrial sites, sweeping up hundreds of workers, even in strategically important sectors. Or in Europe, where states are reintroducing temporary border checks inside Schengen, framed as security measures. Each of these moves reframes belonging as conditional, something you have to earn, something that can be tested, and just as easily withdrawn.
And that regression into the everyman and ruler archetypes is such a narrowing of cultural imagination. You see it in the way events, whether artistic tours, sports competitions, or even conferences, get rerouted through safe jurisdictions. The result is fragmentation. Innovation shrinks because creative risk is punished. Difference isn't treated as value, it's treated as disruption.
That's the crux of it. There's this surface rhetoric of openness, but underneath it, the classic innocent and ruler codes are just rebranded as risk management. It sounds like freedom, but it functions as control. And the effect is that innovation doesn't spread broadly. It gets pushed into isolated pockets, safe zones where difference won't be read as threat.
Right, and it reminds me of those episodes where we talked about performative transparency in brands. The language is all about trust, but underneath it's the same architecture of control, just dressed up differently.
Now let's turn to managed openness. This is East Asia's version of reform. Cautious, yes, but far from cosmetic. Take Japan's new foreign worker system, South Korea's lifestyle-oriented visas, or China's rulings against extreme overwork. None of these are about flinging the doors wide open. They're designed more like tunable valves, adjustable forms of permeability that let change happen, but on carefully defined terms.
What's so interesting is that these aren't policies born from pure ideals. They're pragmatic responses to necessity, demographics, labor gaps, economic pressure. That's what drives them. Singapore's salary thresholds aren't accidental. They're there to calibrate exactly what kind of openness is acceptable. And even something like China's resignation parties, they're not subversion for its own sake. They're signals that autonomy is being threaded into the cracks of dominant systems.
I'll admit I'm a bit skeptical about whether these managed approaches actually create space for real transformation. Are we talking about structural change here, or just careful tweaking at the edges to buy more time?
I hear the skepticism, Simon, but I'd argue, and maybe this is my optimistic side, that those so-called tweaks can add up to something bigger. Over time, small experiments have a way of becoming normalized. Take the new skills migration pathways. They may look incremental, but in practice they're laying down entirely new tracks for how openness gets structured.
You may be right. What I see here is the explorer and creator archetypes pressing outward, testing new ground, while the sage and the rebel apply pressure from below, demanding change. It's an unstable but lively mix, and that's what makes this form of openness feel dynamic rather than cosmetic.
All right, let's move into locked collectivism, a scenario I think of as a cultural counter-reformation. After all that experimentation and cautious opening, the system snaps back into enforced conformity. States retreat into rule by obedience, narrowing the range of discourse in the name of cohesion and stability.
And this is where optimism really crashes into a wall. You see it so starkly: China banning humor and memes that question the official story, Venezuela tightening control over NGOs, Paraguay replicating the same playbook. Any voice that channels the rebel, the sage, even the magician, those archetypes that open space for feedback and transformation, gets silenced. The system seals itself off, and what looks like cohesion is actually brittle conformity.
And it's not confined to politics, it seeps into culture too. Satire like Kong Yiji gets branded as negative energy and stripped from public space. The innocent and ruler archetypes take center stage, manufacturing a sense of unity. But it's brittle. What you get is surface order, not real cohesion. Resistance doesn't vanish. It goes underground, or sometimes splinters into digital subcultures that move faster than repression. But honestly, I'm not convinced that's enough to counter the clampdown.
That's really the key question. Can suppression actually hold over the long term when digital pathways and new archetypes keep bubbling up? Or is it just building pressure, widening the cracks in the dam until the whole structure gives way? Let's try to synthesize. When I look at the US and Europe, once held up as models of pluralism, they're now narrowing who counts as included, often under the banner of security. Policies become loyalty tests. Migration is reframed as conditional, a filter for allegiance rather than a channel for exchange.
And then if you flip the lens to China, you see youth disillusionment, overwork, and unemployment playing out in memes like tangping or Kong Yiji. Those aren't minor jokes, they're resistance languages that dramatize cultural fault lines. Meanwhile, Japan and South Korea are taking managed, pragmatic steps to open up, never ideological, always framed through necessity. And Latin America sits in paradox, exporting reggaeton as a global symbol of hybridity, while at home, political movements still cling to residual codes, sometimes even trying to clamp down. That tension, global fusion on one side, local retrenchment on the other, wraps together into the same story.
Yes, and reggaeton in particular fascinates me. It's the perfect embodiment of this dazzling, messy hybridity. A cultural code that moves from the streets of San Juan or Medellin to global stardom, reshaping how belonging sounds and feels. Yet at the same time, it faces backlash at home, criticized for being too disruptive, too transgressive. That's the paradox. The symbolic export radiates creativity, while the politics around it often retreat into something more retrograde.
Right, and reggaeton makes the contrast vivid. Hybrid culture thrives on TikTok and across streaming platforms, while backlash plays out in legislatures and political discourse. The regional story isn't one of simple direction, but of tension between structural habits that cling to the past and the transformative friction that keeps pushing forward. As we start to land this, what stands out to me is how each scenario cascades into the big systems we all live inside: innovation, work, education. Cosmopolitan laboratories quicken innovation because emergent archetypes are constantly creating, connecting, remixing. Fortress individualism fragments it. Elites thrive in enclaves, but the wider system shuts people out. Managed openness moves slowly but steadily, striking a balance between creativity and order. And locked collectivism, well, that just stalls the engine. When obedience is privileged over originality, innovation dries up.
And what strikes me most is how all of this is downstream from narrative. Meaning comes first. Policy follows. The stories and archetypes that circulate in culture become the raw material governments and companies later codify. That's the big lesson I keep returning to after decades of watching grand narratives unravel and reform. Culture writes policy, not the other way around.
Which is both daunting and motivating. It means those of us paying attention carry a bigger responsibility. We can read the signals differently and maybe even design futures more deliberately. The contest between cosmopolitan laboratories and locked collectivisms isn't abstract or academic. It's here in the choices we make about what we create, support, and challenge.
Quite right, Angela. That's all for this episode. We hope we've left you with not just questions, but also some useful frameworks for navigating whatever comes next. And as always, Angela, it's a real pleasure tackling these cultural puzzles with you.
Thanks, Simon. This was fantastic. And thank you to everyone listening. We'll see you next time on Analyzing Trends. Take care until then.